Greetings, programs. My name's Wretch, and I'd like to welcome you to Deadlands Noir, that old-time religion, a visual novel set in the Deadlands RPG universe. Now, I'm somewhat familiar with Deadlands. A lot of my friends played Doomtown, which was a Deadlands card game set in the Old West, and I also had the board game Battle for Slaughter Gulch. I had no idea that Deadlands actually went into other time periods, and this one is set in 1930s New Orleans. So let's go ahead and get started. I already went through all this to make sure that everything was recording well. So, Harvey's office. A priest, a rabbi, and a Hungan walked through the door. No, it wasn't the start of a joke. I really wish it was. It was instead the start of a couple of really bad days. Mr. Harvey Jenkins, yes? That was the priest, a small, portly man in the usual black slacks and shirt, with that white square for a collar that's the usual dead giveaway. He looked as nervous as a rabbit at a coyote convention, eyeing me and much of the decor in my ramshackle office with barely concealed discomfort. I couldn't really blame him. I looked like 100 miles of bad road on the best of days. My last 3 cleaning ladies all quit after less than a week each on the job, and there are things in my office even I don't like to look at if I can help it. The rabbi was less nervous by far. In fact, he looked entirely amused. You certainly fit the descriptions we've been given, Mr. Jenkins. To a T, I might add. I instantly liked this guy. He was burly, but he had the build of someone who worked hard most of his life and knew how the world worked. He just had a way of putting folks at ease, which was probably a good thing if you're going to be a Jew in the Deep South. Mama Bonte, she don't lie. I told you she knew this man. She know him, and she know he be the right one for us to call on. The Hungan was wearing a rather dapper gray suit with a matching fedora, and though it was clear he didn't need it for his lean, athletic frame, he had a fine black cane with a silver head of some kind of lizard on it. With eyes almost as black as his skin, he studied me hard, and I shifted under his gaze. Something I can do for you, gentlemen, or are you here to take turns trying to save my sorry soul? Each of the men chuckled at that, even the priest, though the Hungan never took his eyes off of me. The other 2 seemed to be waiting on him, so the room got quiet as we all looked at him. Finally, he grunted with some semblance of satisfaction. Yeah, he the one. He been touched by something, and it mocked him, but he got a strong soul and a good heart, so he the one. Gentlemen, I'm sure this all means something to you, but the only reason I've not been inclined to toss you collectively out on your keisters is because I don't tend to like to get on the wrong side of the clergy, and Lizard Kane here had a good sense to mention Mama Bonte, who I owe a couple of favors to. Still, you're cutting in some prime drinking time here, so if there's a point... More grins, and the rabbi laughed congenially as he plopped down in the chair right in front of my desk. The Hungan grabbed a stool nearby, and the priest went over and sat gingerly down on the couch I normally use for a bed when I'm too tired or drunk, usually both, to trudge home to my apartment. I figured it best not to tell him how much blood and booze had been soaked in by those cushions. Didn't look like he needed any more reasons to be nervous. I'm Rabbi Koch, but you can just call me Saul. My esteemed colleagues are Bishop Brian McLaughty and Daddy Thunderhand, one of the Hungan, I can't pronounce that so I'm not going to try to, of New Orleans. I was a bit thrown by the introductions as I heard of all 3 of these men. Rabbi Saul Koch was the leader of the largest Jewish temple in the greater New Orleans area, while Bishop Brian McLaughty was one of the movers and shakers of the city's Catholic community. As for Daddy Thunderhand, there were few in Nolans who didn't know of the man who could make it rain and call his faithful to war if he so chose. Most of the police department was on orders to just leave him alone unless they directly witnessed him murdering someone. Just what were the 3 of the most powerful religious leaders of New Orleans and the surrounding parishes doing in my humble office? I was pretty sure I wasn't going to like the answer. I hate being right about such things. Harvey, may I call you Harvey? I nodded at the disarming rabbi. What we have here is a very difficult situation, one that promises to make a lot of trouble for a lot of good people if we don't take action. You see, there's a reason 3 gents like us can get along well enough to come see you at all, or at once like this. Heck, we even get together and play cards over good wine and nosh, talk theology without coming to blows, and genuinely like each other. Saul beamed at both of the others, who smiled affably enough back at him to let me know he wasn't just throwing a line. Thing is, it wasn't always like this. You gotta expect that religious divides can be hard to overcome, and they can make for some ugly relations for the folks who believe so differently. Poor Brian's predecessors were constantly having to beat their parishioners over the head and shoulders with the New Testament, trying to keep them from heading over to the voodoo parts of the city and setting fires. Which would have been a bad move, since that means Daddy's folks would have fought back with God knows what and turned the whole city into an arbiter. Naturally, my people would have just been crushed in the crossfire, them as didn't side with the Catholics in the first place. Do you know why none of this has come to pass, Javi? Why we haven't had nasty little religious wars in one of the most vulnerable cities in this part of the world? I'd have to say, Saul, that I haven't given it much thought. I guess maybe I should have, but... I shrugged and took another sip of bourbon. I almost offered Bishop McLarty a swig, as he looked like he needed it. Instead, I passed the bottle to Daddy Thunderhand, who smiled and accepted. Then the bishop spoke up. Mr. Jenkins, it is well that you don't concern yourself with such matters normally. That is, in fact, a testament to the man we've come to ask your help in finding. He is the reason our communities are at peace with each other, and why we are even able to come together in times of crisis and work as a single community when the need arises. Daddy Thunderhead chimed in. Surely you noticed there be one man missing here, yeah? It took me another minute, but it finally hit me. There ought to be a Baptist here. I'd guess that would be the good Reverend Kellerman. They all smiled at that, and Bishop Brian went on, actually seeming to relax a bit as he did. Indeed, Mr. Jenkins, it would seem our collective hopes that you would be quick on the uptake are well-founded. Reverend Paul Kellerman is the man most responsible for the relative harmony New Orleans enjoys from its spiritual communities. He preaches a message that is big on love thy neighbor and judge not lest ye be judged, and he does so with great charisma and leadership. In short, Saul butted in, he's kept the peace among us for over 20 years. Now he's missing, and we're all more than a little worried because it's pretty clear there's been foul play and we think it's way beyond the ability of the police to handle. They ain't got nobody who can handle the powers we think be at work here. The whole city's starting to go dark already, with demons and shadows playing on the edges like they waiting for something to start. The Hungin said all of this as though it were perfectly normal and not at all like something out of a cheap pulp novel. The trouble was, I knew he was only too right about what really lived in the shadows. I'd already been chewed up and spit out by a few ugly beasts from beyond in my time here. That was, in fact, part of why I owed Mama Bonte a couple of favors. So you gentlemen want to hire me to find Reverend Kellerman. And when I say hire, I hope you realize that a good heart and owing Mama Bonte favors doesn't help pay the rent on this office or put more bourbon on the shelf, so... Another hearty laugh from Saul brought a return grin from me. Not to worry, Javi. We'll be paying you top rates, plus expenses, and a bonus you can take a vacation with if you find Paul. There's plenty of wealthy and powerful folks who support our cause to keep the peace in New Orleans, so the funds are there. In fact, he reached in his pocket, pulled out a check, and slid it across the desk at me. That's when I knew I was in trouble. It was the biggest retainer check I'd ever received. The three gentlemen pointed me in three different directions, after which they left to attend to their flocks and see what they could do about the supernatural threats they each perceived. Bishop McLarty encouraged me to start with the scene of the crime itself, which was Reverend Kellerman's office at the St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church, one of the oldest churches in the city. He told me to look up the church secretary, a Miss Mary Carmichael. Saul thought I should go and see the Reverend's daughter, Rachel. He seemed pretty adamant about it, and he warned me that she was already being guarded by the police against possible kidnapping. Daddy Thunderhead recommended I look into the dealings of one Gospel Devino, aka Brother Gospel Divine. A newcomer to the Big Easy, he was setting up a huge tent revival out on the edges of the city, preaching about cleaning the sin out of New Orleans. The other two weren't so sure, but the Hungin seemed convinced the coming troubles were somehow linked to him. Naturally, I also figured on a fourth path, the one that always did me some good when things got weird and potentially dangerous. The streets of Nola were full of wise and sharp-eyed folks, and with the right word here, the right amount of money there, a man can find out almost anything. If he doesn't find a bullet or a knife in his back first. So now it's telling us where we should investigate first, so give me one sec, guys. So we have the choice between Reverend Kellerman's church, we can hit the street and see what's going on, visit Rachel Kellerman, or check out Gospel Divine's tent revival site. I think if this is going to be a murder investigation, we need to find out how he died, so let's check out Reverend Kellerman's church. There's just something about blondes. Mary Carmichael had that peaches and cream complexion you hear women going on about. Long, wavy hair that flowed around her face as she bent down over her desk, looking at some paperwork. A figure that went a few degrees shy of plump in every perfect way you might hope to find in a farmer's daughter on a cold and rainy night out in the middle of the sticks. This is not the kind of woman I expected to be working as a church secretary, but I always welcome pleasant surprises. My life was entirely too full of the other kind these days. I'm sorry, Mr. Jenkins, but the last appointment I have on record for the Reverend was with his daughter, Rachel. She was supposed to meet him at 7:30 p.m. here to discuss some matters of their estate, but then they were to go out to dinner. It was well past my normal quitting time, so I wasn't here when... She paused, and tears started to well up in her robin egg blue eyes as she looked at me. Oh, I am so sorry. I just can't imagine why anyone would do this to him. He's such a kind and giving man, so full of the Spirit of the Lord. She fingered her rather ostentatious gold and diamond cross with worry. I moved past her and into the Kellerman's inner office, which was an absolute wreck. The two flatfoots who let me into the place were hovering over by the other door, mostly enjoying the view of Mary Carmichael. Neither had the look of future detectives about them. I looked around at the scene, and I immediately figured a few things out. Someone either wanted to make this look particularly violent or just really didn't care what got messed up when they came for Reverend Paul Kellerman. Despite the mess, though, there was no sign of blood. Either someone did a fine cleanup job, or the preacher didn't put up much of a fight. The place had been dusted for prints, of course, but as many folks as came and went through here, that didn't seem likely to turn up much. As I continued slowly wandering around his office, I asked Miss Mary, "Did the Reverend have any enemies, ma'am? Was he in any kind of feud or quarrel you know about?" "I tell you, Mr. Jenkins, Paul was one with the Lord. He truly loved all of his brothers and sisters in Christ." I began to get the feeling from the look in her eyes as she talked about him that perhaps she wanted to know more of that love than most. From what I heard, however, the man had been utterly faithful to his wife, even after she died. Even so, Miss Carmichael, men like the Reverend can stir up people who don't necessarily believe in what he does, right? I gave her a steady, reassuring gaze, wanting her to believe I really was here to help. Apparently, I passed some kind of test because she glanced nervously at the two donut eaters before making her way conspiratorially towards me. In a much quieter voice, she said, "Well, now, he did have some real concerns about that new fellow with the tent revival that recently arrived in town. The one they call Brother Gospel Divine?" "The very one, Mr. Jenkins. Their one and only meeting did not go well at all, I'm sad to say. Brother Divine seemed to think the Reverend's overly tolerant nature towards the other religious groups was a sheer sign that the apocalypse would begin right here in New Orleans. I mean, the very idea." She looked genuinely outraged, clearly remembering the incident. This dame had it bad for the Reverend, that was for certain. "Is there anything else you can think of, ma'am? Anything at all?" "Well, I don't like to start rumors, Mr. Jenkins." "Mary, his life is clearly in danger. They're not rumors if there are clues I can use to save him." She seemed to grasp that. Her eyes got wide, then narrow. "Well, Mr. Jenkins, it's just that I kept noticing how the Gospel Divine and Paul's daughter, Rachel, kept looking at each other. It seemed pretty certain to me that they knew each other from somewhere, and there was a lot more going on there than the Reverend knew. I had meant to warn him, but it's just not that easy to bring a thing like that up. You understand?" I nodded. "Thank you, Miss Carmichael. You've been very helpful." Just as I turned to leave, I noticed two coffee mugs on the desk. One, which seemed likely to be the Reverend's from where it was laying on its side, had a strange stain in the bottom. I grabbed it, took a sniff, and then scraped out some residue and put it in a small metal vial I keep for such occasions. The other, mostly still full cup of coffee, had lipstick on it. I took the stuff I scraped out of the Reverend's mug over to a friend of mine's shop. Doc Carver's got all the science learning I could ask for, and fortunately he'd gotten around to forgiving me for the last time I'd involved him in a case. He checked it out, and sure enough, my hunch was right. Poison. The kind that puts a man out for hours. Time to look into the other matters. Well, interesting. Well, we can check out the streets and see what's happening. Let's go see Rachel Kellerman, since we know that there's a connection now. What is it about preachers' kids that always puts them in the middle of the worst kinds of trouble? Yeah, I know, a pretty dumb question to ask. Truth to tell, Rachel Kellerman was the least like the stereotype I'd ever met. Her brown hair was perfectly coiffed in the latest fashion, and her clothing, while not quite society elite, was certainly of a style and cut that spoke volumes about the circle she was used to traveling in. She exuded class and poise with just the right mix of prim and proper presence and an undertone of pure sex. Then again, maybe she was more of a preacher's daughter than I figured on first blush. We met in the sitting room on her very fine townhome with a pot of tea steeping and tasty little cakes at hand. I had to pass through two solid-looking uniforms to get through the front door. It was only because Rabbi Saul Koch asked the mayor personally to have the police cooperate with me that I made it this far. There were two more bright and shiny young cops in the back, and a patrol car made a regular pass around the neighborhood. Apparently the city was taking the Reverend's kidnapping pretty seriously. Sitting with us in the nice little room was a lump of tan slacks and a white rumpled shirt named Hal Blake. He was nervously playing with an unlit cigar, sticking it in his mouth one minute, fidgeting with it the next. Clearly, Miss Rachel Kellerman wasn't having any smoking in her fine place, which was fine by me. Anything that made Hal Blake unhappy made my day just a little bit better. Hal was an ex-cop in the way a guy least wants to be. Fired for being on the take. He was accepting bribes from competing crime gangs, and it was making his bosses look bad. Blake went from a disgraceful police career to a fairly dismal PI business. He did have the one advantage of being a really good shot and having a pretty fair rep as a bodyguard, which was how he was making his rent most days. Hal and I got along mainly by avoiding each other like bad diseases, which of course wasn't working out very well today. I chose to ignore him. He chose to glare at me. "So you say you didn't see your father at all the day he disappeared? Is that right, Miss Kellerman?" She leaned forward to start fixing herself a cup of tea, letting her blouse open just enough to hint at the rather exquisite she made such efforts to barely conceal. "Mr. Jenkins, I've certainly regaled all of these facts to the police detectives to great exhaustion. Surely you can just read the reports they've taken?" Her genteel southern accent absolutely flowed like honey from her ruby lips, and there was no mistaking the subtle sense of mere toleration of my intrusion in her manner. Nonetheless, she was the perfect hostess, also pouring me a cup of tea and, with raised eyebrow and a mere nod, figuring out how I liked it. As with all things, straight was fine with me. She then set a tiny little cake on the same saucer as the tea and handed it to me with absolute grace and a fine smile. She didn't offer Hal anything. I just couldn't help myself. I tasted the cake and made a satisfied face, then took a sip of the tea. I hate tea. Utterly. I hated Hal more, and the extra heat in his glare made the swill worth swallowing. I set down my saucer and cup. "Ma'am, I just want to be sure, since there's some evidence to suggest that someone was there in the office, enjoying a cup of coffee with him at the time he was taken." There, that was the moment. Hal's constant fidgeting with the cigar paused, and there was a flicker in her eyes. I'd been at this too long to miss such things, which is part of why I make any money at this job. Of course, it's also the kind of thing that's likely to get me killed. Perhaps even today. "Mr. Jenkins," she went on, decidedly cooler in her tone, "I'm not quite sure I understand what you are implying. My daddy loved Mama with every bit of his soul, and I am certain he hasn't so much as thought of another woman in the year and a half since her passing." Hal was still fidgeting, only he wasn't glaring at me so much. I considered this a clue. I'm a real pro that way. "Miss Kellerman, I meant no disrespect. I'm just trying to help find your father, same as the police." Hal finally spoke up, even though Rachel had made no indication she wanted him to. He apparently didn't make a very good trained goon. "Geez, Harvey, you not get a look at that blonde at the church? Gotta figure she might have had a cup of joe with a preacher every once in a while, yeah?" Rachel glanced ever so casually at Hal, then nodded and smiled at me. "Yes, I'm sure that's it. Mary is very loyal and friendly to Daddy, and I am sure it's nothing more sinister than that." Pointing out that I've already determined she was nowhere around at the time of the kidnapping, as well as the fact that the shade of lipstick that had been on the coffee cup matched Rachel's perfectly, didn't seem the wisest move just now. Instead, I just smiled, stood up, and nodded respectfully. "No worries, Miss Kellerman. I'm sure you're right. Sorry to have bothered you. Have a fine day." I put on my hat and showed myself to the front of the house. Hal Blake followed me, none too subtly. "Why don't you find some cheating creeps to peep on, Harv? This one's out of your ballpark." "Better than bringing a football like you to a baseball game, Blake." It wasn't good, but it was all I had, since I was plenty distracted. I'd caught a glimpse of a stack of mail that someone had nudged up against on the way past the little table next to the front door. I'd always had sharp eyes. The day I couldn't see so great anymore would be the day for me to buy a fishing boat and make for the Florida Keys. There'd been one piece of mail I thought very telling, and I meant to find out what it was telling me. It was directly addressed in flowing script to one Rachel Kellerman. The return address, also handwritten, featured one Gospel Devino. As I made my way down the sidewalk, I spotted two pieces of walking granite matching my pace across the street. Black suits, black shirts, no ties. A nasty X branded on their foreheads. I was just starting to think about which alley to duck down when two more stepped right in front of me. One pointed and shouted, even as the first two broke into a run towards me. "We have come to bear witness." I need to think fast. Oh. Nothing for it but run. The high ground. Don't they always tell you to go for the high ground? Yeah, sure, it worked for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Why not me? The odds are rarely in my favor whenever I find myself in a fight. A few friends I have in this world tell me it's karma or the sins of my past. I think it's just the nature of my business. A lone investigator snooping into the business of powerful people who can afford to hire groups of folks to beat the crap out of me. I could run, but that wouldn't tell me much about these guys, and I had a feeling I needed to know just what I was dealing with. A stand-up fight wasn't a good idea either. I've been known to handle myself well in more than a few one-on-one brawls, but it takes a special kind of stupid to think you can go to distance with 4 sides of beef at once, even if you have some heat. Besides, I didn't like shooting anyone if I didn't have to. The paperwork is a real pain in the ass. Doc Carver was in the big one, and he always talks about taking the high ground when things get dangerous. Seemed like a solid plan this time, so we dove into the alleyway the two new arrivals had just left and made for the nearest fire escape. After a bit of jostling with each other, the 4 monsters made their way after me, reaching up even as I was pulling myself to the nearest landing. So far, so good, but I was starting to think I needed to elaborate on my plan a bit. After all, once we got to the top, it was pretty much the same story, only now they had gravity to play with when they got their hands on me. Gravity. See, Doc, I do pay attention sometimes when you start spouting all that science stuff. Instead of making my way up the ladder to the second landing, I grabbed the underside of it and braced myself just as the first big man made his way near the top and started reaching for me. He was just starting to shout, "We shall bear witness!" at me again as I firmly planted both feet square into his pie hole. Teeth shattered and he lost his grip, plummeting back down the ladder and taking his 3 friends down with him. I slid like a fireman down the ladder after him. The one I kicked was already out, and the one right behind him was nearly down for the count. The other 2 were scrambling to their feet, but I managed to grab a brick on the ground and clock both of them before they got their bearings. I was pretty upset by the fact I had to hit each of them twice to make it stick. I popped the nearly down one in the back of the head with the now busted brick, then paused to let the shock of the fight wear off while I looked to see if there was any more trouble coming. Once I was satisfied things were done for the moment, I checked on my playmates. Each of them was wearing some kind of really odd medallion around his neck. It was an iron circle with some kind of weird lines on it. I think I'd heard things like this called runes once or twice. I went ahead and took all 4, then made my way out of the alley. The last thing I needed was some wandering patrolman deciding he needed to run me in for questioning. I had better things to do. Okay, guys, well, we were able to fight off some people following me. I guess this may be part of Gospel Divine's cult that he apparently has under his command. But we will find out in the next episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed this so far. If you liked the episode, go ahead and click like down below, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, that'd be a big help, and we'll see you next time. Later days, everyone.